Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Media wars have entered new territory. Secretary of State John Kerry, members of the EU, and the military alliance NATO all have singled out this television station, RT, as some kind of security threat. Since when is holding and broadcasting different opinions or narratives a threat to global media freedom? To Crosstalk, the West media war against Russia, I'm joined by my guest, Anthony Salvia in Washington. He is a former appointee of Ronald Reagan at the U.S. State Department. In New York, we have Don DeBar. He's an anti-war activist and host of a daily radio program. And in London, we cross to Martin McCauley. He's a specialist on international affairs at the University of London. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. Don, if I can go to you first. I didn't think when I started working at RT that I actually make a program about RT and my program, Crosstalk, here. And I, of course, no doubt read a lot of the commentary about myself, my program, and this television station. And what really bothers me about it, you can criticize it all you want. That's fair game. We're in the public realm. But I don't understand why it's being criticized, because no one ever gives me an explanation why they don't like it. And no one has been able to explain to me, coherently at least, why so many people watch us.
Well, first of all, the reason people watch you is because there is such a narrow band narrative across the U.S. media about every important international and national event that goes on that excludes most of the facts that many people are aware of, that they go looking for more information. You don't stumble on a Russian TV network or a media outlet in the U.S. when you have a vibrant local media that you've been familiar with since you were young. You do that. People go out looking for food when they're hungry. They fall asleep on the couch when they're full. And the reason that RT, Press TV, I mean, Iranian news channel, you know, a number of them, Telesur from Venezuela, these are popular in the United States because the facts that are missing from the narrative that help make people understand events around them, because the narrative doesn't fit the events, this thing that's missing, they're seeking it out, and they're finding it elsewhere. And this is one place that they're finding it, but a billion of them found it at YouTube. There's a reason for it.
Tony, one of the things I find really remarkable is why is a military alliance, NATO, getting involved in this? The State Department is all up in the air about this. I mean, John Kerry came out a couple of weeks ago and saying that RT is broadcasting in foreign languages that people can understand. I mean, just his kind of linguistic expression about what the station's about made me wonder if he even knows what he's talking about. Because it seems to me the product that they're producing is unattractive. That's why people are looking for to other places. It's not because RT or Press TV or other stations are so superlative. It's just that they say something that is more coherent. Go ahead.
Well, that's right. I think it is more coherent. It's also unique. I mean, in other words, there's a U.S. line, for example, on certain issues like the question of Ukraine. You know, it is gospel truth on U.S. media that Russia destabilized Ukraine. Now, the question of what role the U.S. and Europe played in the events in Maidan, you know, last year, is simply swept under the rug. On a thing like RT, you're more likely to hear the other side of the story. So this answers the question, the need for balance, which incidentally, when the U.S. was creating things like Radio for Europe and Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and broadcasting to the former Soviet world, you know, one of the justifications, and I was part of that because I was Moscow bureau chief of Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty back in the Yeltsin years, was, you know, offering an alternative to the Soviet line that was prevailing inside the USSR. And I think here we have a chance through things like RT and other international broadcasters to offer an alternative. And that's something that has ironically, the Western powers upset. Okay. They want the monopoly to continue. Okay. It's vital to policy that the monopoly be there.
Absolutely, Martin, because it's the gospel truth. And this is what I find really interesting, is that I live in an era, in a time, in my media experience here, my career, is that a level of intimidation. If you don't speak the gospel truth, you're a liar, you're a propagandist, you carry water for the Putin regime. You cannot even get into a debate, because debate means that you somehow doubt the gospel truth. What is the truth? Here at RT, we want to understand what the truth is, and there's a lot of room for disagreement. Go ahead, Martin.
There is, and the reason why John Kerry and NATO and other people are getting so het up and get excited about RT is because they're getting their message through. They're becoming influential. They are, in fact, countering the arguments of the establishment. They're contradicting John Kerry, and he finds that very uncomfortable, and he doesn't really know how to respond to it. If you look at the American media, you could say that most people get their news from television, so therefore they turn on the television set and they expect it to be simple and direct in very plain language and so on. And you can look at ABC, NBC, CBS, more or less, you say, a balanced presentation of the news, but again, pro-Ukrainian. You go to Fox News, and they don't pretend to be objective. They say, we've got a line, we're going to plug this line, and anything which is anti-Russian, that's very good fodder for us. And anything that any Ukrainian says, which is negative about Russia or brings up anything, we'll use that, and so on. So the average American is caught between these two, and he doesn't really have an alternative. And if you plug one line all the time, people get bored.
Yep.
They want something, they want an alternative. That's what taxi drivers tell me, that they switch into RT just to get another point of view, and they listen to it, and that's quite interesting and so on, because they're looking for a different narrative. They don't want one narrative all the time, because the trouble with John Kerry and the State Department and the American government is there's only one narrative. Okay. One point of view and so on.
Well,
and
I mean, Martin, let me jump in here. Let me go to Don here, because that one point of view, that narrative is collapsing as we speak here. A few weeks ago, a couple months ago, the New York Times came out with an article, and it was their reassessment of what happened in Maidan. I thought it was absolutely hysterical, if it wasn't really tragic, is that here they are writing about what happened in Maidan, and then a few months later, or a year later, they say, well, you know, it probably was a little bit differently. I mean, they're even writing their own revisionist history. But let me get back to the point here. What we hear all the time, that apparently what I'm doing at this television station is that, you know, we're obfuscating the fact that Russia is an aggressor in Ukraine. But I would posit you a different narrative. What we're supposed to do on this program is that who invaded Iraq in 2003 on the false claim of weapons of mass destruction? Who bombed Yugoslavia for 78 days in 1999? Who attacked Libya in 2011? Who's droning Pakistan every day? You never hear about those narratives. So it seems to me it's a form of projection. Don't look at what we do, but look what they do. And you know what? We don't have any evidence to show you they're doing it. You just have to believe us.
I'm glad you mentioned the word evidence. Essentially, these narratives that are put out, let's assume there are a multiplicity of them, from place to place, each one, you know, advocating for some set of interests. One for American megacorporations, one for Vladimir Putin personally, which is the fiction here. In the court of public opinion, like any court, the fact-finding process consists of adversarial presentations. I present my evidence and my witnesses. You challenge it. You present your evidence and witnesses. I challenge it. All of this takes place in front of a jury who gets to examine the process and then make a determination according to well-established rules as to what the facts are and how they bear on the law that's being applied to the case. Now, when you have only one side that goes into a courtroom with only a portion of a case, if it's not challenged, that side will generally win anyway on default. And so no matter how ridiculous the pleadings are, unless they're so ridiculous that the court intervenes, and this is fairly unusual, even if I make an absurd set of claims against the adverse party, if they're not there to counter them, then I win by default. And that is more or less the condition that has held sway in the West for decades here. You have, and it's become worse since the 1990s, even the 80s. But certainly since the Telecom Act in '96, there is such a concentration of ownership of the media. You have to keep in mind, by the way, that the large bulk of the media in the United States and in Western Europe is privately owned, and it's privately owned by a very small set of people whose interests you can see extremely well expressed through the media. Whatever narrative is being told, whatever counter-narrative they might make reference to, never challenges the foundations of power of those entities or those interests that own the media. So that is the first tell about the very nature of the media.
Okay, you know, Tony, we're really in very dangerous times right now. We're not talking about a small country in Latin America or Africa, which doesn't mean you shouldn't tell the truth about it. But this is, you know, getting to a point of a confrontation that it's going to be difficult to wind down. And when we see the Europeans and the Americans very much at odds trying to figure out what to do. I mean, the Europeans want to set up some kind of Russian language station, but now they're arguing what they should be saying on it. Again, it's very incoherent from their point of view. The thing the Americans don't like is that the narrative that Russia is proposing is getting traction, and it's not just in alternative media, it's moving in slowly but surely on the fringes of the mainstream.
Well, that's right. You know, the Europeans say they'll come up with some kind of plan by June of some kind of Russian language broadcasting entity. But you raised the right question. I mean, what on earth would they say? I mean, are they just going to parrot the narrative that we're already getting from myriad, you know, Western media organizations? In which case, what's the point? They're wasting their money. You know, it's really, you know, basically, you know, there's a policy here of you know, where it all goes back to Washington approaching Moscow and saying, you know, either you will comply, either you will cooperate, or you'll be treated as an adversary. You will align your policy with ours, allow your foreign policy to be made in Washington the way the Germans and the French have. Or you know, you're an adversary, and we're coming to get you.
Okay. And, on that depressing note, we're going to go to a short break, and after our short break, we'll continue our discussion on media war. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the West media war against Russia. Okay, Martin McCauley, I'd like to go back to you in London. It seems to me the fury that is coming out of the State Department, some capitals in Europe, and some very, well, lunatic fringe elements of NATO, I'll be kind in my commentary there. The reason why they're so furious and there's so much fury is that the West operation in Ukraine has gone so very badly, and they need to find a culprit. And Russia is always a good culprit for them, and for a wide variety of issues that we could talk about for hours. We have the character of Vladimir Putin that is a brand that sells very well to demonize. But at the same time, Victoria Nuland and her henchmen really turned the cart upside down, and Ukraine is an absolute mess. And that narrative is becoming more and more aware in Western audiences. And they have to say, no, we can't talk about this, because this is a catastrophe of truly biblical dimensions.
Yes, I think you put your finger on it, because why the State Department is so angry, and John Kerry and others are so angry, is because the American narrative, the American administration's narrative is not getting through, beginning to fragment. And they wish their narrative to go through and to be convincing and to be accepted by the American public, because they are the government. They are responsible for American foreign policy. And if you have that narrative countered, then the policy is countered, and the policy begins to fragment and is not successful. It will not enjoy the support of the American population, American voters, and so on. They will rebel against it, and so on. So therefore, if you look at Victoria Nuland and others in the State Department, there are those in America who would like to continue the conflict in Ukraine and up the tempo and so on, arm the Ukrainians and so on, so that they can mobilize, if you like, public opinion in the United States to support this, because they will say, yes, we're defending freedom and we want to make free Ukraine from the domination of Russia, which is ceded autocratic state. And Vladimir Putin, as you say, is demonized. He's the bad guy. And if you put him up on American television, then he's the boo person. You then oppose him and so on. And you've got to vilify him, because If he appears to be soft, if he appears to be more civilized and so on, that destroys the narrative. So therefore, he has to be seen as the enemy, and Russia has to be seen as the enemy, with Ukraine being the victim. You must portray.
Let me go to Don here. You know, we unfortunately we had a few days ago the crashing of that German airliner. Tragic story. And the more we learn about it, the more tragic it is. But you know, it's quite interesting. You know, 36 hours later, those black boxes were read very clearly. What happened to that airplane? MH17. What happened to those black boxes? Or maybe nobody wants to talk about it anymore because it'll play into Russian propaganda. Go ahead, Don.
Well, first of all, I'm sure I'm not the only person on planet Earth that was sitting around with a little stopwatch next to the TV waiting to see how long it would be before CNN floated the idea that Putin downed that German plane.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there has, you know, from the very beginning, there have been all kinds of facts that were made available to the general public that, you know, ran counter to the narrative about not only Russian involvement in the downing of that plane, which was strongly suggested if as subtext, but bear with that, but also, you know, their enabling of it by arming these crazies, supposedly, who are, you know, their brethren in the East and acting as their, you know, dubious or, you know, unknowing agents. That whole narrative has been collapsing, and it's interesting because it has to be constructed really only for Americans.
Yeah.
For example, people in Bahrain know exactly what that scenario is like.
Yeah.
They have been occupied by Saudi Arabia at the request of a discredited government to support it against a genuine, popular, universal popular uprising to protect a major American military base. Now, that is a fact pattern that, if it's permitted, would have permitted Russia, the moment there were protests on Maidan, to occupy and pacify Ukraine, to protect its naval base, to solve the political crisis there on its border, and to make sure that the power elite that was friendly to it remained in power. That is what Russia is entitled to have done, or would have been entitled to do, if what Saudi Arabia did in Bahrain is permitted. And I haven't seen anyone sanctioning Saudi Arabia or bringing this up at the Security Council or any of that. I mean, there are clearly many standards, but people all over the world lie in relation to the United States and its policies towards others in the same way that the people of Bahrain do. There are so many victim nations around the world and victim peoples around the world that the narrative doesn't sell to them. It only sells to the domestic audience here.
Okay.
And let me tell you just quickly, so every day I get up and I have to prepare a news program and figure out what it is I'm going to say. And I'm essentially trying to take the stories that are in the media and provide the missing facts so that people can do a proper analysis. That there is such a steady stream of missing facts to choose from that are so readily available outside American media that it's almost a hard job because there's more than you can fit into a half hour.
Don, we're both soulmates on that one. Okay, let me go to Tony in Washington here. You know, you know, looking at Victoria Nuland's testimony to the U.S. Senate about what's going on in Ukraine, I mean, I wasn't the only one. And you know, actually, I think moving forward, I'm just going to cite Der Spiegel and other Western media outlets, their analysis. You don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to RT. You can listen to other media outlets and their criticism of that kind of testimony. And it ends up being just surreal, absolutely surreal in what she had to say. And if and MH17 was mentioned, even grammatically, the way it was constructed still gives this doubt of, you know, it must have been the Russians that did it without saying it. What accounts for that, Tony? You've been in the U.S. government. Why do they dig in their heels? Are they going to make RT an issue of confrontation? Is it really worth it? Is it worth it to them? And do you think they can get it past audiences and voters in the U.S.?
I just think they have to maintain the information monopoly, the monopoly on the narrative. We saw that in the Middle East repeatedly. We've seen it in dealings with Russia. It is simply vital to what they're trying to do. If they don't do that, then moral questions begin to be raised, and the American people might be beginning to ask questions like, do we need a new foreign policy? Do we need a whole new approach? Why did we ignore what Reagan and Gorbachev achieved in the end of the Cold War, when there was the prospect of a new kind of pan-European entente that was in the offing from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with North America cooperating with all, and people may wonder why are we not having peace? Why instead are we pushing for what appears to be a very confrontational stance vis-a-vis a major nuclear power? Nobody's questioning this really in the U.S. media, but if they lose the information monopoly and the control of the narrative, people will begin asking a lot of uncomfortable questions. Okay. That's their fear.
Okay, Martin, but I think a much more intelligent, a mature approach would be to assume that you cannot keep the monopoly. Anyone that thinks they can do that is living in the Soviet Union. Okay? You're living in the Soviet Union if you think you can do that. And the Soviet Union, one of the reasons why it came down is because it couldn't maintain a monopoly on information and, quote-unquote, the truth. I think a much more nuanced foreign policy would be to be able to engage and have much more sophisticated approach to explaining what's going on and explaining your interest, as it were. The U.S. State Department's not doing that, and a lot of people in Europe aren't doing that.
I think from the American and European point of view, the narrative is quite simple. Russia is the bad guy, and we're the good guys. And they want to keep to that narrative, because if you break it down, then the sanctions come to an end. They probably will come to an end this summer anyway. So why do we continue with sanctions? And if that breaks down, then the whole narrative about Russia being the bad guy and we're being the good guys, that goes, because you're no longer punishing Russia for doing something which you opposed. So from the American point of view, they're in a very difficult position, because if the Europeans then fragment, they in fact change sides or they become neutral, then America doesn't really have an ally in looking at Russia and the Ukraine. And it is, one could say that over the last 70 years, 80 years, Russian-American relations have been tense. They're only a very good time, perhaps during the war, and then a few years under Gorbachev, they were quite normal or friendly and so on. But normally there's tension there, especially with Britain as well. Britain and Russia have never seen eye to eye because they were great powers in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries and so on. So history is very, very important in this. History plays into all this, into the narrative and so on, and how people see this, because they grew up, everyone who grew up in the Cold War looks at Russia as the enemy.
Okay, hey, we're rapidly running out of time here. Let me go to Don in New York. You know, Don, one of the interesting things that most people in the West don't think about, certainly they don't think about it in the U.S., is that Russians are learning English, exponentially growing every single year. I mean, it's amazing. When I first came here, not very many people spoke English. Now you can go and you can get, people can speak basic English, and then you have a really smart cadre of young people that speak English perfectly and understand it well. That's not happening in the U.S. That's not happening in Britain. And you know what? They read the Washington Post, and they read the Financial Times, and they read the New York Times, and they say, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? You're not talking about the country that we live in. We don't walk around and think about Vladimir Putin every single day. We have very basic needs and interests, remarkably similar to people in the West. But you won't find that in Western media. Go ahead.
Actually, you know, I was pondering this. I think it's actually been happening much longer in Russia. I was pondering this when you were mentioning earlier about, or someone mentioned earlier about Kerry and the Europeans wanting to broadcast in Russian to the Russian people. When I was in Russia, in Soviet Union in 1990, okay, there were many Russians that would walk through the lobby of a hotel and see CNN on there in English and stop and listen and watch. Many people spoke English in Moscow even then. And here in the United States, they ran ITN for a very short while on one of the networks. This is part of the, Glasnost and all of that. And they had to be translated for people to understand.
Okay, Don, I'm sorry I have to jump in here, Don. We've run out of time. Fascinating discussion here. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in New York and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk rules.